As you know, Kim Jong Un is the autocratic head of state of North Korea, and the regime is highly repressive. Isvahl wanted to, in this play, Party of Un, explore how a hypothetical conversation between a socially aware version of Kim Jong Un and his therapist might look. Isvahl believes all humans, even the most violent and cruel, are still driven by the same neurological structures and biological forces as the rest of us, and that it's possible to empathize, and even, as blasphemous as it might sound, be compassionate toward all humans, including those with the cruelest and most monstrous track records, to examine the systems that created them and exaggerated their flaws rather than judge their moral worth. Without the full truth knowable, Party of Un is an exploratory look at the possible machinery of Kim Jong Un's psyche that we hope can at least provoke thought.
So let's dive right into things. I know you're a busy man, Mr. Jong Un. What brings you to therapy today?
Deep down inside, I sort of hate myself. I honestly find more happiness in ignorance than introspection. But I thought I should at least give a tiny breath of air to the voice inside my head that's discomfited with my choices. Well, my choice really, which is to live.
You only have one choice?
Yeah, if I want to live, I keep going. If I want to stop, I kill myself. Because I can't keep going in only a moderate way and suffer through all the cognitive dissonance of the pain I cause every day. I sort of have to choose to enjoy my exploits. Because otherwise I would cause myself knowing suffering, which is practically impossible for any human being to do.
It sounds like you're saying the only way for you to be good, so to speak, is to kill yourself.
And probably my whole family for good measure, honestly.
I might need you to break this down for me.
Yeah. Okay, where do I begin? I guess, so I'm alive, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and my family's alive, and our parents and grandparents were all alive and survived until they died, but they weren't killed.
Okay, tracking.
And the more evil I am, the more money and power I accrue. And the more money and power I accrue, the happier and safer I am.
Could you give me an example?
Let's imagine a garment tailor in Chongqing named Hui. She asks her manager if she can use a small piece of leftover fabric from off their floor to make a couple pairs of extra underwear for her younger brother, as they've lost their parents. The manager says the government has asked their company to put as much fabric as possible toward earning for the country, and it would be unpatriotic to use the material for her own needs.
And this is just a little scrap of leftover fabric?
Yes, just a scrap off the floor.
Okay.
However, the company is able to use material to regularly replace the cloth they use to clean the portraits of my father and grandfather on their office walls.
Ah, the mandatory portrait cleanings.
Mm-hmm. Now, Hui mutters under her breath that it's ridiculous that the regime can waste fabric to make sure these portraits are cleaned with fresh cloth every week, but can't spare any cloth for basic hygiene, like underwear, that her family needs. She mutters this in front of her co-workers and manager.
Okay.
So now the manager has no choice but to report Hui to the local behavioral police, and they investigate her and decide to err on the side of caution and send her to prison camp, along with her brother.
Just that generation, since their parents are gone. What about grandparents?
It would actually be 3 generations, obviously, but for simplicity, we'll assume everyone else is dead.
Okay.
Now, in that camp, they beat her and her brother up with pipes. And while typically this beating would only be done in response to a disobedient act, in their case, it was done because her brother was in a prisoner labor group that missed the lumber hauling quota.
Well, I'm sorry, this is a dumb question, but...
Doesn't beating them up make them more likely to miss their next quota again?
Yeah, I mean, they're injured. How can they produce?
Yeah, so there's a complicated logic to the beatings. This predates me. But one benefit of beating workers early on is that it weakens their will and helps establish dominance. So they start to truly see themselves as human tools and sort of know their place. It does reduce output short term, but does have a bit of a countervailing effect of motivating them to produce out of fear. Long term, the benefit of the prisoner's identity reconstruction can outweigh the immediate productivity cost.
Of the early beatings. By identity reconstruction, you mean the early beatings caused them to reform their identity as slaves, essentially, and then become more docile?
Yeah. The second reason the beatings take place is just classic warped management incentives. The low to mid-level guards have to explain to their superiors why they miss quotas, and one way to do that is to scapegoat the prisoners and demonstrate that, they're taking some action by beating them. Hopefully this shouldn't be surprising. We're not a highly educated society by design.
To preclude opposition, right?
Yeah, and so these games tend to work. And they cause a bit of an inefficiency tax, but the system as a whole works.
Okay, so the brutality you oversee, even if you didn't invent it, although you continue to purport it in the prisoners' camp, it's necessary to preserve the system of power that you have in place.
Mm-hmm.
But there are two ways you could feel about it. You could sort of begrudgingly accept it, or you could maybe enthusiastically enjoy your job and your life. And what was interesting that you said was that in a way, you couldn't do the former. You almost have to do the latter and immersively enjoy the totality of your life. Can you explain that more?
So I live this billionaire lifestyle in a way, right?
Yeah.
I have private chefs. I have literally billions of dollars in banks in Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, China, Singapore. I have Dennis Rodman fly over for private performances from North Korean dance troupes. You name it. And I could, in theory, forsake many of these joys.
Okay.
I could give up my private yachts and water parks and my resort homes. But I can't do a bunch of unthinkably hurtful things to people all around the world, not just my own citizens, but I make massive amounts of crystal meth that ruin Americans' lives all the time, and fund my regime and not enjoy the spoils of all the atrocity.
I see.
First of all, the cognitive dissonance alone and the constant agony of facing what I'm doing with no materialistic release would be depressing beyond reason.
Oh, interesting. So, in order to sort of countenance the brutality of pain you cause, you need a dopamine release of some kind. That makes sense.
Right. I have no choice but to fund my regime and my hierarchy to stay alive. But I am alive. And while I'm alive, I'm going to want to enjoy myself. And frankly, the more I enjoy myself, the more convinced my first and second tier cadres are among the elite classes that I'll continue to spoil them, and that I actually want this whole system to run the way it does.
You have to sell yourself on the joy of it to sell them on the joy of it.
I mean, they need resorts and water parks and Mercedes-Benzes to be incentivized to keep the system going as well. The ones that know the secrets, which is roughly 10 to 20% of the country, they depend on the benefits of higher status, and of course a healthy fear of monitoring and punishment to keep propelling the system of propaganda and forced labor that keeps my country afloat and my family alive.
So is it that at a certain point, you have to just accept the ugliness as part of the life that you were handed, since, as you say, you either propel the system forward or you risk death? And that given the options are death or essentially evil hedonism, to use colloquial terms, you may as well indulge in evil hedonism?
Yeah, you really can't try to be sober about the whole thing, partially because it also leaves you vulnerable to people seeing through your mask and questioning your commitment. In a way, I can sort of blame God or blame existence for being what it is, and then justify my actions to myself as simply being survivalistic. And it significantly reduces, cognitive dissonance and gives me that ignorant bliss state.
Almost an if you can't beat 'em, join 'em type of thing.
Right, exactly.
So then what brings you here?
So colloquially, people might call it guilt, but perhaps more accurately, it's this sort of empathetic pain. And I'm very knowingly burying it. But I mean, it's a fuck ton of pain, right? Like an entire fucking country is basically suffering because I can't give up my life.
Sort of like latent guilt, if you will.
And I do think about suicide. But it's not that simple or easy. It's not obvious that if I kill myself, my family would survive. Or even that the country would stabilize and avoid civil war. And if there was civil war, even worse, starvation. And of course, having nuclear weapons around doesn't help in a situation where there's a civil war.
You mean, if civil war were to break out, the fact that there are live nuclear weapons in your country could lead to a disaster. So you stepping down and that leading to civil war could actually lead to a worse outcome, such as unexpected nuclear detonation, than your staying in power and maintaining the state's stability?
It's hard to calculate the precise probabilities, but even other governments like South Korea have considered that possibility.
That you is better than civil war and instability. And what if killing yourself didn't lead to civil war, but instead enabled a peaceful transition? Although it's tough if you don't know which eventuality would be more likely. And I'm not condoning suicide, by the way, just making sure I understand your perspective. In the US, we're all sensitive about suicide, but it seems less taboo in North Korea. Maybe out of necessity?
Definitely out of necessity. It's such a mess, isn't it? It all comes back to, if I'm given this life, do I end it to save others? Or do I blame the universe for burdening me with the premise of a lifelong Sophie's choice and accept others' pain as part of the inescapable bargain I was born with? And I've chosen to blind myself to the pain to live my life fully.
To experience the full range of human emotion.
I mean, in a very weird way, it's not my fault. And I do draw a bit of a parallel. We eat meat, which requires harming and killing other animals, but we do it and forgive ourselves for it, even though in theory, we could all become vegetarians.
I see. So you're saying that you were sort of born into a trolley problem, an almost impossible one that you can't escape. And you have the same indulgences as other humans, so you try to balance your own joy with the horrors of reality. And what would be an ideal option, if one existed?
I mean, it would be nice if I thought I had an escape plan for my family that could lead to a transition of the government into a stable and healthy form, whether that's autocratic like China or democratic. But I can't trust that China would ever protect us, and I can't know that a witness protection-like program would be an acceptable standard of living or even safe.
Right. You need to trust that the government overseeing the witness protection program were stable and maintained its position toward you. If they underwent a leadership change, they could change their stance. And their protection program could get corrupted and accidentally expose you.
Or my family.
Got it.
And by the way, I should mention, staying in North Korea and stepping down is a death wish. No matter how much I apologize for my family's actions, it's just the fate of every prior dictator that's gone from being in power to not. Muammar, Saddam, you know.
So then the question becomes, how do you deal with the suffering you have to propel?
Yeah. And for the most part, I can mentally stomach it. But there are times where it creeps up on me, where I read the stories of defectors that suffered torturous pain. And yet that intense hatred among my soldiers for these defectors has to be there.
Why is that? Why do you have to villainize dissenters and defectors with the extreme level of violence that we see televised?
Because if the defectors are humanized, our soldiers might be more likely to accept bribes to let them defect.
You mean to minimize the sympathy quotient? And defectors are that important?
Honestly, defectors are the biggest threat to the regime. They are intent on sharing information back with, my citizens.
And that information?
Yeah, it would cause unrest and skepticism toward me.
And skepticism would result in less inclination to follow the rules, more unregulated market activity, more performative obedience, with a little wink and a nudge when you're not looking.
As opposed to people truly being brainwashed and believing all my propaganda horse shit and following our monolithic belief system and all that nonsense my great uncle wrote.
It's interesting. I did read that article of the North Korean soldier who was killed in Ukraine, whose diary they found. He seemed to truly adore you and feel a deep sense of patriotism, even in his private journal.
Precisely. I think the combination of military pride and all my semi-religious brainwashing truly convinces people to believe our mythology deep down to their core. The threats and fear of punishment just help kind of buttress up those beliefs by exploiting a different emotional circuit. The two together are what makes the magic of my empire tick.
Empire or cult?
Yeah, fine, cult. So anyway, I basically just live in this world where everyone wants to kill me. And so what do? I thrive with the life I'm given. I treat it like a basketball game, and I dribble the ball like my hero to this day.
Michael Jordan.
Number 23, baby. If I lose and die, I lose and die. But I did it on my terms.
So then, what does the future look like for you? What's your vision, if there is one?
Just death. That's it. Keep fighting till I die. There's no other out for me.
And how does that make you feel? I know it's a cheesy therapist question, but still.
When I think about it too much or allow myself to adopt a victim mentality, it makes me depressed. But when I can stay focused on winning and truly try to appreciate the benefits this lifestyle affords me, I can at least live like a normal human being.
Normal, you said.
Maybe not normal in what I'm responsible for, but normal in that I thrive on the pleasures I obtain in life. The fact is, the more pain and suffering I cause, the more power and money I accrue, and the more power and money I accrue, the more secure and joyful I am. Fuck the universe, right?
So, the full spectrum of human pleasure and pain. Understood. Maybe switching topics a bit to open up different thought vectors. I did read about your interaction with Vladimir Putin recently. How are things in respect to the Ukraine war?
So when you have sanctions against you for any standard legitimate business, you end up only dealing in the dark arts, or black markets as you'd call them. So weapons, drugs, counterfeits, slave labor, these are the things we do. I've always had good trade agreements with Russia, and they helped me acquire all my Mercedes vehicles from my key staff.
To keep them incentivized.
You know, and now that I have more to offer Vlad in terms of munitions for the Ukraine war, it's fantastic to get the extra income. We're getting both revenue and oil from them, so that helps with our energy needs. But I know it's not forever.
Do you feel like you're wholly dependent on them?
I have a few other good trading partners. Iran buys weapons and chemicals, and we've sold certain nuclear secrets to them. China, obviously. You probably know that I met with Donald Trump a couple times. I was curious what the U.S. would have to offer, but obviously I wasn't going to let go of my nukes, so it was mostly just a learning expedition for me. One day we may need to play ball a bit more with the United States to get sanctions relief, but the Ukraine war is making it easy for me to defer on that.
Okay, so the Ukraine war is giving you a bit of an emotional reprieve, or at least a reprieve from the U.S., because you're getting this extra income right now, which means sanctions are less of a worry?
In terms of am I wholly dependent on Russia, I mean, no, obviously not. The Taliban has made some purchases, and a few African countries have too. But most of our business all comes from Xi.
Oh, China, right.
Yeah, so I meet him the most. I don't trust him, though. He probably hates my guts, to be honest. But he knows he needs my country to remain stable and avoid having a mess to clean up on his border. And he gets non-zero economic value from me. So he's going to keep trading with me as long as I don't bring any serious U.S. military threat to his door. He's smart. I don't have to explain my situation to him.
His team already gets your situation, basically.
At least I think so. Like, he could have shut down my Chinese bank accounts, but a few years ago, he proactively safeguarded them from a United Nations sanctions attempt.
Oh, right, I remember that. The UN sanctions attempt on your bank account were in the news. And yes, I remembered she blocked that transaction.
I think, or hope at least, that Russia-Ukraine will go on for another year or so. Vladimir didn't want to move too fast to demolish Ukraine completely. And believe it or not, that's because Vlad has a heart. Well, and because war crimes against Ukrainian civilians that are too intense all at once could lead to more global sanctions against his federation.
and potential direct NATO involvement in the worst case, I imagine.
Yeah, if he just kills everyone in Ukraine, he makes it hard for NATO to look the other way.
And what does that mean for you?
For me, I absolutely have to capitalize on this. I'm making $25,000 a year for each soldier I send, Vlad, and that helps me decrease my reliance on Xi and his crew.
Okay, so you're playing Russia and China off with each other, getting money from both so you aren't cornered by either. Is this part of a bigger mental model for how you run your country?
I have 3 key levers to play with.
And what are those?
I need money. I need to suppress dissidents, and I have to keep the anti-US and anti-South Korea propaganda machine going, so my people have enough emotional balance behind their worship of me.
So you need your people to feel like they're constantly threatened by the US and South Korea. And what's the problem with a more, I don't want to say complacent, but perhaps peaceful or stagnant calm among your citizens?
Stagnancy could lead to unrest or alternative leadership based on other factious movements.
Unrest or alternative leadership. Okay, I get it. So you're saying that some kind of dynamism, purely for the sake of dynamism, is necessary to propel your leadership.
Exactly. People want to be led. So you have to invent something for them to get worked up about and lead them. Otherwise you get bogged down in domestic arguments. A common external enemy unites the domestic populace, right?
And that's true globally or just for you?
Well, it's funny. Vlad didn't quite need that much of an external distraction. In fact, the internal opposition, like Alexei, was enough dynamism for him to keep emotional momentum going among his people.
So you don't think Vladimir felt threatened by Alexei Navalny? Isn't it possible Vlad felt threatened enough by Alexei that he saw a Ukraine invasion and war as a good reconsolidation opportunity?
It's a good question, but I mean the real question is whether he could have killed Alexei in prison without the Ukraine war going on, or whether Russians would have protested more strongly in that event. Maybe not.
You mean maybe he couldn't have gotten away with killing Alexei had the Ukraine war not been distracting his citizens?
Yeah, maybe he did need distractions like mine. And this is where I have a much lower cost of distraction because I don't need actual war. I have enough information control over my citizens that I can just make up a story about imminent attacks and keep the momentum going.
And Russia?
Russia's population has too much access to outside information for that to work. Vlad was able to cook up the idea of anti-Russian and Nazi violence within Ukraine, but couldn't have cooked up something more compelling like, say, a planned Ukrainian invasion of Russia. So his soldiers had to go on defense instead of being tricked into going on defense.
And beyond Russia, what other countries weigh on your mind? Do you think about the most recent U.S. presidential race much?
Well, we wanted Donald to win, and hopefully ramping up rhetoric close to the election helped that happen. All those nuclear facility pics and shit.
By using those nuclear images to scare Americans? And that may have helped motivate a vote for Donald Trump?
Right. It may have helped in 2016. It was a little less clear this year that Donald intended to be more peaceful and accommodating toward North Korea than Kamala did. So it's not certain how much our threats to help influence the election outcome actually benefit my gains of getting sanctions relief. Likely he would be, though.
Why is that?
For him, it's about just doing something. Being able to show that he's done a deal, that he can champion as a success to help boost his image. Even if the effect of the deal is relatively immaterial to anyone. For the Democrats, it's mostly about strategic patience. And my old UK ambassador, Tae Yong-ho, summarized that in his interview after defecting. That fucking asshole.
Actually, let me interrupt you there for a moment. You seem to express a bit of outrage or anger or emotion about Tae Yong-ho, your ambassador who defected. Is there resentment there?
Honestly, no. I completely understand why he did what he did. And we have a system, and the system my family set up is imperfect. I had to kill his and his wife's parents, or maybe we tortured them, I can't remember. And we put his siblings on TV, so he got the message. And they'll bribe a few of the officials to try to get out of the labor camps, and it's kind of irrelevant now anyway.
Okay, so they can bribe their way out of retribution.
I have a certain amount of leverage over these ambassadors. I can hold their families hostage, and I can try to find them post-defection and kill them. And I can lavish them with gifts when they do go abroad and come back loyally. The calculation ends up being how much is the external opportunity?
By external opportunity, you mean external to North Korea?
Yeah, like embassies, basically. So how much is that external opportunity to either influence world affairs from a foreign embassy or conduct revenue ops for Room 38, which is my dollar-making global network, worth to me? And is it worth more than the probabilistic risk of one more defector helping the existing defectors try to topple my regime through various, information activism and lobbying efforts?
Are you worried that you can't really staff reliable ambassadors because they'll just keep defecting?
Obviously, there's a high rate. I mean, even when I was in high school in Bern over in Switzerland, and I was posing as the kid of the ambassador Regan, who was my mother's brother-in-law, those essentially like foster parents of mine ended up defecting to the United States to run dry cleaners out of New Jersey once my mom died.
Why?
Because they knew they had no value to my dad anymore. So they wouldn't have any privilege. So now a United States lifestyle looks more appealing. It's funny, Regan says publicly in the papers he wants to return and hopes I'll give him a chance. But I know he's bullshitting to make sure I don't kill him or hurt too many of his relatives back here. It actually helps me to not immediately hurt all their relatives, sometimes because then you maintain a little bit of leverage and fear. So the information exchange gets a little nuanced. It can be okay for folks in my ministry to inform them what's happened to their family. So it can make them be careful to ensure worse things don't happen to more of their family members. That said, they can also share what I do to their family members with international bodies, which can lead to more human rights pressures. So keeping them in the dark often has the necessary deterrence effect. But going back to your question earlier about the US election, since Donald wants to create the headline that he took an action, he'll likely ease sanctions on me for promises of not manufacturing future nuclear warheads. The ROI for me of having more nukes obviously has diminishing returns. But it's still nice to sort of blow people away with just how many nukes I have. Vlad in Russia has the largest arsenal out there with about 6,000 or so nukes. And it only takes a couple hundred of those 100 kiloton nukes to trigger nuclear winter and end human civilization. So like if I announce I have something like, say, 20,000 of these big-ass nukes, people will shit their pants so hard they might not even want to drop those USB balloons over my land anymore. Something about the number being so big, like that I could spare a bunch, or just that even the direct impact to the top few thousand cities would be enough to annihilate countries immediately. Of course, past that kind of number, it's really a waste of money. So in that way, Donald would stop me from having that extra alpha. But at the same time, the sanctions relief would enable me to invest in more propaganda and counter-propaganda, and probably continue a bit of nuclear development in stealth. I mean, the threat I pose to the US isn't the possibility of more nukes so much as it is having nuclear capabilities at all. But it's hard to know. Perhaps either Donald or Kamala would have been fine with a 20% pullback on sanctions to dismantle Yongbyon and a couple of my nuclear R&D sites and promise not to build new ones. And that might be okay. I'd still need to publicly threaten the US and South Korea periodically because I need to keep my troops motivated. But I'm not sure the US gains very much from that partial relief and denuclearization. Probably what it does is when the president at the time put political points for striking some kind of deal with me and enabling the continued USB-type interventions without nuclear winter or annihilation-type fears of my building up a sublime stockpile. But the benefit for me of having more liquid capital exchange is probably greater than the risk. To the degree it helps me fund propaganda, keep my cadres happy. You know all that.
So, do you feel for the people you're hurting? Does it hurt you to hurt others? I mean, I realize you have to hurt them to continue living somewhat securely, but how does it make you feel?
Look, my dad was defending his father's empire. He was a target, like me and my grandfather from a young age. There were plots against my grandfather, against the government. And my dad felt very patriotic in that sense. That he had to build our image, and he felt pride. It was like a sports game to him. And he took it a bit far in terms of Hollywood-style propaganda and violent pageantry. But those became institutions. With this business, you can only go forward. It's very hard to dial it back. I was born with that proud, patriotic dad, and I knew he wanted a strong son to support him. I didn't think I'd be king. Jong Nam...
Your half-brother?
Yeah, Jong Nam was slated to be the leader, so I assumed Yong Chul, my full brother, and I would be heads of other official branches. But Dad kind of always floated this carrot that he might give the marshalship to one of us, and that he hadn't decided yet. And then my brother, Yong Chul, he's a softie. He was always into music, playing guitar. I loved Eric Clapton too, but Yong Chul is a stan, seriously. I think he might be closeted, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but I don't think he's pounded other dudes. Because trust me, I'd know. I mean, I don't want to know, but I'd know. But regardless, it's like we all know he was just never going to kill someone if he needed to.
Do you think that shaped you as a kind of alternative to him?
Yeah, 100%. I put on the tough guy act to please my dad. It was probably a bit disappointed in Julie. That's what I call him. Look, I enjoy running my country. It's a privilege in certain ways. I don't willfully starve people for fun. We're poor, and our destiny's shaped by our history. If it comes out that we lied about our standing, or the Korean War, or the accomplishments of my family, or how insane it is that we brutally punish people for not worshiping our pictures.
Well, at least compared to what people in other countries do.
Me and my family are dead meat if that shit comes out. When Joseph died of the Soviet Republic, Nikita Khrushchev and then Mikhail Gorbachev weren't tied to his brutality as closely because they weren't his heirs. And they could have said they were just following Joseph's orders. But for me, not only am I third generation, my homeboys like Cho Song and Keon Tek are all third gen too. Their entire privilege derives from the brainwashing of generations, and then it becomes a family identity thing.
Like people just identify you as individuals with a legacy of your family.
People will just want to kill us all for being born rich.
Just like the US and all other countries do?
Yeah, basically.
Is there anyone whom you feel you can trust? I mean, your parents died when you were quite young. Besides your siblings, who do you depend on?
I knew Cho Song's parents, so we were able to connect socially once we were both back in Korea. I've known Yong Nam my whole life. He's been supporting our family since my grandfather, and I've never gotten the slightest suspicion of him. Plus, he's a weak old man, so there's that. But I don't know, sometimes I buy the act like he truly seems to either care about our country and well-being, or just has insane discipline. But I've always been able to trust him, so to speak. And he's great about not talking shit about other people, so he hasn't landed himself in trouble with the other elites. It's like the benefit of trade specialization. He's this foreign policy expert who's cultivated relationships for decades, and is super consistent about checking his strategies against mine, and informing me of anticipated responses. He truly sticks his neck out for me, and always has. I spied on him and found nothing. He just serves dutifully, and in the end I rewarded him for that, gave him a very comfortable retirement.
You just never felt threatened by him, I guess.
Yeah, I guess that's it. Everyone else posed a non-zero kind of threat, but Yong Nam, I could let him go.
So, what's next? What's on your mind?
Well, I want to build on the Russia alliance. Obviously, I'm sending troops to help with Ukraine. Iran seems friendly as usual. And I think the main question is, how far can I take my relationship with Russia and China, with Russia, before China cockblocks me? But the thing is, China is debt financing this war. So it's not entirely useless to them for us to be helping Russia advance. The main question they have is how much of a monopoly they can have on my trade. And even that seems less concerning to them than the mere existence of our country as a buffer to South Korea and United States influence. If I become completely independent of China, they would dislike that. But I could probably go as far as 40% dependent on them and still get away with it. What I really need is social harmony, non-interference, no more sanctions, and no dissidence among my population. Then everyone will be happy. I do need a bit of occasional threatening from the US and South Korea so I can motivate my troops and maintain the sort of bloodthirst motivation that keeps my whole security infrastructure activated and energized. But I don't need any real intervention. I guess you could call it a healthy tension.
Tensegrity.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. South Korea is one of our biggest donors of aid over the years. Isn't that ironic? They know the game cold, obviously.
How long can that last, though? Can you keep your population in gleeful ignorance forever?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a natural tendency to believe that as the information age proceeds, truth comes out more easily. But that's an invalid assumption. I mean, of course, that's a risk, but it's just as possible to keep folks confused through misinformation. And the arc of technological development doesn't have to imply daylight.
Okay, so as technology improves, it doesn't mean people become more informed.
I think Russia has proven this, and so have hard-right Republicans in the United States. So yes, forever is in fact an option. A country isn't as delicate a thing as people may mistake it to be. States can be remarkably resilient.
Are you happy?
I'm going to take a circuitous route to answer this. John Mearsheimer talks about this idea that everyone, well, he says every state, but really what's true of a state is more true of an individual. But John says that everyone just wants power. That's all we're striving for, right? But while at an ape level, there's truth to that, a more forgiving way of describing our disgusting human nature is to say that we all want safety. That's really what we want. Safety does require power, but it's really fundamentally about security and safety. I just want to be comfortable and know that my life will be protected. In many regards, I'm looking for the same thing every other world leader is: stability. My grandfather was this really thoughtful, strategic thinker. He crafted this state in the image of Joseph's Soviet Republic and executed every detail in intense and rigorous diligence. He implemented checks and counterchecks, and with the help of Russian experts, improved on all the power structures Joseph had innovated and Vladimir Lenin before him. My father was the natural heir, again, to keep my grandfather safe. Whom could he possibly trust more than his own kin? And who else besides his son could lay claim to inheriting his power in a way that mollified all the other stakeholders? But my dad was born into this world where now there was a tension in place. His father and his father's allies were in power, and there were many, many disgruntled citizens looking to topple his family. Of course, there were millions of docile followers as well. But the combo of foreign adversaries like the United States, neighbors like South Korea, and local dissenters meant there was an ever-present threat on his mind. And that's people actively hating you, actively trying to kill you. So you have to fight back just to survive.
So your dad was conditioned to be aggressively oppressive because there was always someone behind his back ready to kill him.
And me, and my brother and sister and half-brother and half-sisters, all of us We're born into that same cauldron of hatred and violence and counter-violence. I want peace and prosperity like everyone else, but I am cursed with the burden of secrecy. I have to keep all my citizens in the dark in order to live.
And that means limited commerce with other countries?
For the most part. Although I think the United States gets it, they are willing to lighten sanctions to denuclearize me.
So maybe this is a good time to circle back to why you're really here. Maybe let me take a stab at it. You seem wise enough to understand that the Western media portrayals of you as some kind of selfish man-child are completely unnuanced and ridiculous. Even I, an objective person who's just met you, can intuitively understand that the probability you, your father, and all your family members just so coincidentally happen to be born psychopathically selfish is not probabilistically likely. I mean, your grandfather may slightly have been so, but really, even he seemed more like an opportunist, perhaps a slightly calculating one. And even your father did seem to give in to base desires and gluttony, but I mean, he wasn't born into stability from the get-go. He had to witness his father achieve that. So there's a bit of a first-generation grappling effect there, like any other first-gen heirs of wealthy or powerful families around the world. Americans and other global citizens are perfectly guilty of gluttony, but the question really comes down to you. Are you gluttonous or are you pragmatic? Is that what you're really here to find out?
Perhaps at a deep level, yes. You're right that I'm smart enough to know that Western media portrayals blatantly oversimplify my situation. I do think there are times where I have to ask myself whether I'm being overly selfish, and whether I should just accept a risky or negative outcome to myself in order to better the lives of the millions in North Korea. But the real question is, am I any different from anybody else? I mean, you tell me, if you or any other normal person were me, would you or they truly do anything different?
I'm probably going to lose my license for saying this, but I think not. At least not a lot. And I don't think you're any more terrible at your core than most of us. I think the system you're in is terrible. But I truly believe you're trapped and you're partially a victim, but I don't feel sorry for you. You have incredibly privileged life, despite the risk to it. For the most part, you're indulgent and ecstatic. Of course, there are times I see you gloat and smile on television, and it's hard to imagine smiling in the face of all the horrors you commit. But I also understand the need to keep up appearances to project strength, and more importantly, to sort of buy in to this role you have to play, because you can't fake it 100% of the time without being able to trick yourself into believing a lot of the heinous things you say and do to maintain safety for yourself and your family. Where I might personally differ from you is how I think about my family. In particular, your children. Are you setting them up for a continuation of this barbaric existence? Or do you think that upon your own death, you'll be able to hatch an escape plan for your children and your siblings so the country can go into revolution, but they can stay safe?
Well, I have Jue, and I couldn't have not had her, because what on earth would have been my reason for not procreating? If I didn't offer a long-term stability package to my cadres, they'd be plotting against me immediately. There's a question as to whether the cycle will simply be endless. Will she just live the life I lived and have kids again, and the cycle just keeps going on? And I need my other children in case anything happens to her, or for any reason she proves incapable of taking leadership. Because again, the lack of, a line of progeny is an immediate weakness to my reign. My cadres can smell weakness like that and jump on it, because they also need to be 100% certain of their continued privilege.
And safety, right? So is that why you had more children?
Yeah, I had to keep up appearances. 3 seemed like the right number. I could have just had 2, but it just seems odd for a world leader to not want more children. I didn't want anyone suspicious of me.
So you don't see any end to the cycle?
I would love to have a post-mortem revolutionary plan for when I die, where my children and other family members can escape to safety.
Is there one?
I thought about whether I could negotiate such a plan with South Korea or the United States or even Russia or China. But even the information that I might be willing to do this, just that information alone, gives any of those powers tremendous leverage over me. That's the thing about me. I'm perhaps the one person in the world who cannot be leveraged more than anyone else.
When you say you cannot be leveraged more than anyone else, you mean to say you're the least leverageable person, human, in the world?
Even Vladimir, his army pledged allegiance to his country, not to his family.
And you?
My army not only pledges allegiance to my family instead of to our country, but I control all the information they consume. An activist opponent like Alexei Navalny would have been an unheard of name in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, unlike his popularity in Russia. What sane person gives that kind of absolute power up?
Okay, that's convincing. So tell me, what does success look like to you? Just status quo, or is there a big prize you see at the end?
It's not an obvious fortunate outcome for everyone. It's a tightrope walk, to be sure. I would genuinely like to see prosperity for my citizenry. I don't give a fuck about political freedom. And I don't think they would much either, if they all had relatively happy lives.
Do they?
For the most part. To be fair, I imagine our happiness index is actually higher than it is in many richer countries. I obviously can't measure it because that would give people a reason to seek to improve on whatever it is. But I've hypnotized folks enough that they're happy to follow the path laid out for them. Most humans are sheep after all. You know that as a professional.
True.
But if I can negotiate a reduced sanctions package while maintaining enough anti-US and anti-South Korean animus to keep the army motivated, that could be one good outcome. But if there's too much friendliness with the United States and South Korea, I won't have a mortal enemy to keep my army motivated, and the entire storyline of who we are falls apart. People will want open communication with our new allies, and that will pierce my propaganda bubble.
But you could thread that needle, keep this tensegrity we spoke about going?
It will be a tense and tedious middle ground, but perhaps over many generations, and assuming we can manage reasonable living standards in our country, people might appreciate the stability and be willing to forgive the atrocities my family and I have presided over. But you and I can both hear how crazy that sounds being said out loud, so who the fuck knows?
Maybe not so crazy. I did read that you've eased up a bit on the outlandishness of your propaganda.
Yeah, I've toned down the pageantry a little.
But just thinking about your overall situation, is this why you drink so much? You just have a shitty deal in life and little to look forward to?
Essentially, I'm certainly not afraid of death, except for the implications for my family members. But I find solace in the perks of my role. And I suppose I'm no less of a slave to my circumstances than all other Homo sapiens, right?
Just one with nukes and a pleasure squad.
Just one with nukes and a pleasure squad. I've defunded a lot of the pleasure squad, by the way. That was a fucked up overindulgence by my father. There are dancers, but they still enjoy their own lives. There's no grooming for sex, although consensual sex happens occasionally. I try to be less neo-Kantian than my father, but I certainly indulge from time to time. I allow myself to accept my circumstances and live within them, within whatever fucked up notion of reason I can imagine applying to my situation. Either that, or suicide, or despair. And believe it or not, I don't think any world superpower wants me to be suicidal or despondent. Maybe before we had nukes, but not now. There's enough drama going on in the world.